Welcome to America and Africa History, where we explore the deep roots, powerful stories, and legendary contributions of the Black race throughout world history. Today we begin our series, The History of America. But the story doesn't begin in 1492. Long before Europeans arrived, America was already home to thriving civilizations. America, a land of vast mountains and endless rivers, a place of ancient cultures, thriving cities, and civilizations that rose long before the arrival of Europe. A land whose history did not begin in 1492, but thousands of years earlier. This is the story of America, a story shaped by indigenous nations, and profoundly transformed by the arrival of millions of Africans, whose forced labor, culture, resistance, and resilience would forever alter the destiny of the New World. Long before the rise of cities, long before recorded history, the first humans reached the Americas during the Ice Age. The world was colder then. Massive glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere. The first people crossed into the continent over 20,000 years ago, following herds of mammoths and bison across a land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska. They spread southward over thousands of years, through forests, deserts, and coasts, adapting to every environment. These were not primitive wanderers. They were innovators, hunters, artists, astronomers, and eventually civilization builders. Across two continents, these early peoples developed a mosaic of cultures. Some lived as nomadic hunters. Others created permanent settlements, villages, and trade networks. Slowly, the foundations of great civilizations began to rise. In the tropical lowlands of present-day Mexico, the Olmec emerged around 1500 BC. Their colossal stone heads, some weighing over 20 tons, remain a mystery and marvel. They pioneered early writing, mathematics, and the calendar systems that would influence civilizations for millennia. The Olmec laid the blueprint for what would become the cultural heart of Mesoamerica. Further south, the Maya created one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. They charted the stars with astonishing accuracy, developed advanced mathematics including the concept of zero, and built towering pyramids aligned with astronomical events. Their cities, such as Tikal and Palenque, rivaled the great cities of the ancient world. They were not a lost people, as some claim. Their descendants still live throughout Central America today, preserving traditions thousands of years old. In the Valley of Mexico rose the Aztec Empire, one of the most powerful states in pre-colonial America. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, dazzled European observers with its scale. Canals, floating gardens, palaces, marketplaces, and temples touching the sky. It was a city more advanced than most European capitals of its time. Along the spine of South America, the Inca Empire flourished, an empire connected by 25,000 miles of roads and suspension bridges. They terraced mountainsides, built agricultural systems that still influence farming today, and engineered cities that have endured centuries. Their stonework, precise and earthquake-resistant, remains unmatched. In North America, near present-day St. Louis, rose Cahokia, a city of tens of thousands, filled with ceremonial plazas, pyramid-shaped mounds, and vast trade networks. This was the largest city north of Mexico for centuries. A reminder that North America, too, had powerful nations and urban centers. While civilizations thrived in the Americas, Africa, the cradle of humanity, was home to its own great powers. The Mali Empire, rich with gold, learning, and trade, commanded respect across continents. The Kingdom of Benin produced art so refined that Europeans struggled to believe Africans made it. The walls of Great Zimbabwe rose high above the savannas, testimony to complex African political and economic systems. Africans were explorers, traders, scholars, architects, and kings long before Europe cast its eyes across the Atlantic. This context matters, because the history of America, and particularly Black America, cannot be told without acknowledging the greatness and humanity of those who would later be forced across the ocean. By the 1400s, Europe was changing. Kingdoms were rising. Trade routes were shifting. And European monarchies began exploring the seas to find wealth, spices, and new lands. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all sought power on the oceans. This drive for exploration and domination would soon bring Europe into direct contact with the Americas and Africa. The consequences would reshape the world forever. In 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, stepping onto islands inhabited by the Taino and Arawak peoples. What followed was not a peaceful meeting of cultures, but the beginning of colonization, war, disease, and exploitation. Millions of indigenous people perished in the decades after contact. Entire nations were destroyed. Cities were abandoned. Cultures were scattered. Europe's arrival in the Americas marked the end of one era and the violent beginning of another. As European colonies expanded, they needed labor, massive amounts of it. They attempted to enslave indigenous populations, but disease and resistance made this unsustainable. And so, Europe turned to Africa. What began as a trickle became a torrent. European ships sailed to the west coast of Africa, capturing or buying enslaved men, women, and children. They were transported across the Atlantic in brutal conditions, packed into ships like cargo. This was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history. But the story of Africans in America is not only one of suffering. It is also one of endurance, creativity, resistance, and transformation. Black people would shape every part of the New World through their labor, culture, spirit, and genius. The ancient world of the Americas has now met the forces of Europe and Africa. In Part 2, we follow the rise of the colonies, the growth of slavery, the birth of Black America, and by the late 1500s, the world had changed forever. New European empires clawed their way into the Americas. Indigenous nations resisted desperately. And on the shores of West and Central Africa, millions of lives stood on the edge of a storm. This is the story of how the Americas were reshaped, through violence, ambition, and the forced labor of African people. This chapter is the birth of colonial America and the birth of Black America. The first enduring English settlement, Jamestown, was founded in 1607. It survived only through the knowledge, generosity, and labor of the Powhatan Confederacy, who taught colonists how to grow food and navigate the land. But as more Europeans arrived, fear and ambition replaced cooperation. Conflicts erupted. Native homelands were seized. Cultures were displaced. This pattern repeated as the French, Dutch, and Spanish built colonies across North America. Every colony shared two goals: land and labor. The land came from indigenous nations. The labor would soon come from Africa. In August 1619, an English ship arrived in Virginia carrying a small group of Africans. They were seized from a Portuguese slave vessel. These were the first documented Africans to enter English North America. Some worked as indentured servants, as did many Europeans at the time. But within decades the system hardened. Colonial laws shifted, and a brutal hereditary system of race-based chattel slavery emerged. From this moment on, African identity in America would be shaped by a system designed to extract labor, break families, and erase culture, but it would fail. Because through this suffering, a new people would emerge. A new culture, a new identity, the beginnings of Black America. From the 1600s to the 1800s, over 12 million Africans were taken across the Atlantic. Millions more died in wars, raids, and forced marches before even reaching the coast. Families were torn apart. Children were taken from parents. Entire villages disappeared. On the ships, hundreds were chained together in suffocating darkness. Disease swept through the decks. Many did not survive the journey. Those who resisted were beaten, starved, or thrown into the sea. This nightmare was known as the Middle Passage. And yet, through unimaginable pain, Africans held onto fragments of language, memory, rhythm, and spirit. These fragments would grow into the cultural foundations of African American life. The enslaved came from diverse kingdoms and cultures: the Yoruba, Igbo, and Akan of West Africa, the Congo and Bundu of Central Africa, the Wolof, Monde, and Fula peoples. and many others from regions spanning Senegal to Angola. Each brought languages, music, spiritual traditions, farming knowledge, ironworking skills, and social customs. These African cultures did not vanish. They transformed, blending, adapting, and surviving under extreme oppression. They formed the roots of Black America. As colonies expanded, slavery became the backbone of the American economy. In the Chesapeake, enslaved Africans produced tobacco, the green gold, that financed colonial growth. In the Carolinas, West African rice-growing expertise built massive plantations. In the North, enslaved people labored in homes, shops, docks, shipyards, and emerging industries. Slavery was not a Southern phenomenon alone. New York, Boston, Philadelphia all profited from it. This system shaped every institution: law, religion, education, the courts, and the economy. America was being built, and Africans were doing the building. But slavery did not mean surrender. Every day, Africans resisted in ways small and large. They slowed work. They broke tools. They shared forbidden knowledge. They preserved songs, stories, and rhythms. They built families and communities under constant threat. Some fled into swamps and mountains, forming maroon communities, free Black villages that fought off slave catchers. Others rebelled outright. Early uprisings in New York, Virginia, and the Carolinas revealed a truth colonists feared. Enslaved Africans refused to accept bondage. This resistance laid ideological foundation for demands for future freedom. Under slavery, African and European traditions blended. From this fusion emerged a spirituals, born from African rhythms and Christian themes. A the ring shout, an ancient African circle dance that survived. A new forms of storytelling, call and response, and oral tradition. A early Black churches, which became centers of hope and resistance. These cultural roots would later fuel abolition movements, civil rights activism, and some of America's greatest artistic contributions. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies had grown wealthy largely off enslaved labor. But Britain tightened control through taxes and restrictions. Protests erupted. Colonists began calling for freedom, even as they denied that same freedom to the people who worked their fields and built their cities. A contradiction was forming, one that would define the coming revolution. Colonial anger grew. British authority wavered. Shots were fired. The world was about to change. Black Americans, free and enslaved, watched events closely. Many hoped the coming conflict might be a path to freedom. Some joined colonial militias. Others joined the British, who promised emancipation for escapees. And standing at the very first clash, the Boston Massacre, was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native heritage. He became the first American to die for the cause of independence. And Africans would play a critical role. By the late 170s, the 13 colonies stood on the edge of rebellion. Britain tightened its grip, and the cries for liberty grew louder. But for hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, freedom was still only a dream. As the American Revolution erupted, Black men and women faced a question that would shape their future. Where would liberty be found? The first shots of the American Revolution came in April 1775. Colonial militias clashed with British soldiers at Lexington and Concord. News of the conflict spread quickly from Boston's cobblestone streets to the plantations of the South. Thousands of enslaved people listened closely. Rebellion always brought possibility. The path to freedom, or deeper oppression. In November 1775, the British made a bold move. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, offered freedom to any enslaved African who fled their patriot owners and joined the British Army. Thousands responded. Men, women, and children escaped plantations under darkness. They risked death for a chance at freedom. These Black loyalists formed the Ethiopian Regiment, fought in key battles, and later traveled to Canada, the Caribbean, and even Africa. For the first time in American history, thousands of Africans seized the chance to fight for their own liberation. But not all Africans sided with Britain. Many free black men and even some enslaved men promised freedom joined the Continental Army. The most famous unit was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, sometimes called the Black Regiment. They fought bravely in the Battle of Newport and across the war. African Americans served as scouts, spies, drummers, carpenters, and soldiers. Their presence forced the young colonies to confront an uncomfortable truth. How could a nation fighting for freedom deny freedom to so many? In 1783, the war ended. America was free. But freedom was not shared equally. Some black loyalists evacuated with the British to Canada, Jamaica, England, and Sierra Leone. Others were betrayed, re-enslaved, or left with nothing. In the new United States, a small population of free black communities began to grow, especially in the North. But in the South, plantation slavery expanded rapidly. The ideals of the Revolution had been betrayed. The promise of liberty, postponed. America's founding fathers struggled with slavery during the writing of the Constitution. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and others knew slavery contradicted the ideals of equality. But many were slaveholders themselves. Compromises were made. Enslaved people counted as 3/5 of a person for political power. The slave trade could continue until 1808. A runaway enslaved people had to be returned. These decisions protected slavery, ensuring that the new nation was built on a foundation of racial inequality. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a machine that separated cotton fibers quickly. The effect was explosive. Cotton became the most profitable crop in the world. American plantations expanded westward into new territories. Millions of acres were seized from indigenous nations. This era became known as the Cotton Kingdom. And the Cotton Kingdom ran on enslaved labor. Between 1790 and 1860, the enslaved population grew from 700,000 to nearly 4 million. Families were torn apart and sold across states. Children were born into bondage. The Deep South became one of the harshest slave societies in history. But as the system grew more brutal, black resistance grew stronger. Resistance was constant. It existed in whispers and in shouts. Some enslaved people resisted quietly, teaching reading and writing in secret, using music as coded communication, sabotaging tools, slowing work, and maintaining African traditions. Others resisted boldly. A Gabriel Prosser's planned uprising in 1800. A Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in 1822. A Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Turner's revolt shook the South to its core. In response, slave states passed harsher laws, banned education, and increased patrols. Yet, for every new restriction came new determination. The most famous freedom fighter was Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery and returned repeatedly to rescue others. Her courage turned the Underground Railroad into a symbol of hope. By the mid-1800s, America was splitting in two. The North industrialized and slowly moved away from slavery. The South remained locked in the plantation economy. Political battles raged. The Missouri Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act, a bleeding Kansas, the rise of abolitionism, the Dred Scott decision denying black citizenship. The nation was on a collision course. The question of slavery could no longer be ignored. In 1861, war erupted. The Confederacy seceded to protect slavery. The Union fought to preserve the nation. At first, President Lincoln did not declare the war a fight against slavery. But enslaved people knew the truth: the war's outcome would decide their fate. Thousands fled plantations, seeking Union lines. Others demanded to fight. As the war progressed, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, freeing enslaved people in Confederate territory and allowing black men to enlist. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors joined the Union forces. They fought in some of the war's bloodiest battles. The famed 54th Massachusetts Regiment showed extraordinary courage during the assault on Fort Wagner. Their service helped secure Union victory and proved the loyalty, bravery, and humanity of African Americans beyond all doubt. In 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. For 4 million people, centuries of bondage finally ended. Families reunited. Churches blossomed. Schools opened. Hope surged. But freedom was only the beginning. Between 1865 and 1877, the nation entered Reconstruction, one of the most remarkable and least understood eras in American history. Freedmen built towns, schools, and businesses. Black men voted in large numbers and were elected to office at every level. State legislatures, U.S. Congress, and even the U.S. Senate. Leaders like Hiram Revels, Blanche K. Bruce, and Robert Smalls shaped national policy. For a brief moment, America seemed capable of becoming a true democracy. But the forces of white supremacy pushed back. Violence erupted across the South. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups terrorized black voters. New laws restricted black rights. Northern political will weakened. In 1877, federal troops withdrew. Reconstruction ended. White supremacist governments took control, launching an era of segregation, violence, and disenfranchisement. But Black Americans did not give up. They built churches, businesses, newspapers, and communities that would one day fuel the civil rights movement. The Civil War freed millions, but the battle for equality had only begun. Like, comment, and subscribe. Watch out for Part 4. In 1877, Reconstruction collapsed. Federal troops withdrew, and millions of newly freed African Americans were left exposed to a rising tide of hatred and oppression. This is the story of their struggle to survive and to thrive in a land determined to deny them humanity. From the darkness of Jim Crow to the brilliance of Harlem's Renaissance, this is the next chapter in the story of America. After Reconstruction, Southern states passed a wave of laws known as Jim Crow. These laws enforced separation in every part of life. Schools, hospitals, transportation, restaurants, neighborhoods, even cemeteries. Segregation was not just a social system, it was a legal weapon. Black people were denied voting rights through poll taxes, literacy tests, and violent intimidation. White supremacist groups terrorized entire communities. Between 1880 and 1940, thousands of African Americans were lynched, murdered in acts meant to terrorize and control. But even in this darkness, Black Americans built strong communities anchored by churches, schools, newspapers, and family networks. Their resilience would become a quiet revolution. Despite deep oppression, Black Americans pursued education with fierce determination. They built their own institutions. Tuskegee Institute, Howard University, Fisk University, Hampton Institute, dozens of smaller colleges and training schools. These schools produced teachers, doctors, lawyers, ministers, journalists, and activists. Two key leaders emerged. Booker T. Washington, who emphasized economic empowerment and education. W.E.B. Du Bois, who demanded full equality and political rights. Their debates shaped the direction of Black America for a generation. As segregation intensified, African Americans created their own economic systems. By the early 1900s, cities across the South and Midwest had thriving Black business districts. These included grocery stores, insurance companies, clothing shops, medical offices, barbershops and salons, newspapers, hotels, entire street blocks owned and operated by Black families. This surge in economic self-reliance inspired a new dream, one that would take shape in a place called Greenwood. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, African Americans built one of the most prosperous Black communities in the world. The Greenwood District, known as Black Wall Street. By the 1910s, doctors drove luxury cars. Families owned beautiful homes. Businesses thrived. The community had its own newspapers, schools, restaurants, and theaters. It was a symbol of what Black autonomy could achieve. Black Wall Street stood tall, proud, confident, and vibrant. But its success challenged the myths of white supremacy. And that made it a target. On May 31st and June 1st, 1921, an accusation sparked a white mob to attack the black community of Greenwood. What followed was one of the deadliest racial massacres in U.S. history. For 2 days, homes were burned, businesses looted, entire blocks reduced to ash. Airplanes reportedly dropped incendiary devices. Hundreds were killed. Thousands were left homeless. Black Wall Street, once a shining symbol of black prosperity, was destroyed. Yet survivors rebuilt. They refused to vanish. Their resilience became a testament to the unbreakable spirit of Black America. Between 1916 and 1970, over 6 million African Americans left the South in what became known as the Great Migration, one of the largest population movements in modern history. They traveled to Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Oakland, Cleveland, St. Louis. They sought jobs, safety, education, political power, the chance to breathe free. In northern cities, African Americans became factory workers, union organizers, business owners, and eventually political leaders. This migration transformed the entire nation culturally, economically, and politically. And in one neighborhood in New York City, a cultural revolution was about to explode. In the 1920s and 30s, the Harlem neighborhood of New York became the epicenter of a cultural and intellectual awakening. This was the Harlem Renaissance, a rebirth of black creativity, pride, and identity. Writers and thinkers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, musicians like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, artists like Aaron Douglas. Together, they reshaped American art, literature, and music. Jazz became the soundtrack of a new era. Harlem became the heart of Black America. And the world began to recognize the brilliance of black culture. From the ashes of slavery and the violence of Jim Crow, African Americans built schools, businesses, communities,